Welcome to the first installment of The Writing Life. I'm Markham Pyle, your genial host, and I'll be talking about the art and craft of writing. Actually, I cannot teach art. Indeed, if you have met young Arthur, you know he cannot be taught. Craft, however, I can deal with. It were fairer to say that I am in fact less a host than a mortar section in an infantry platoon. As for geniality and the jovial, I am hardly the bringer of jollity. In fact, I am likely to trade in the sardonic and the occasionally caustic. Such as I am, however, I shall do my best. It has been a vexing time. I am, of course, exasperated by my own ill health and physical limitations, and by their consequences, notably the delay in the 1914 book, and in the final edits to the latest installment of Mr. Weems' Village Tales series of novels, the first delayed by my triple bypass in 2014, the second by my having spent most of 2018 evading death, and much of its last quarter in hospital and damn near dying in surgery. While the Astros appear to be poised, despite annoying injuries, to take it back, not all the hashtags in the world, despite the heroic efforts of Archer, Brodie, Wokes, Stokes, and Leach, seem likely to secure a similarly happy result for England in the Ashes. In public affairs, the best, or at least the well-meaning, are weak as water. The worst, of whom there are a considerable number, are full of passionate intensity, meliorated only by their incompetence, and if that damned falcon does not start heeding me soon, I shall shoot it out of the sky. Yes, you may play spot that quotation as we go. There are, of course, compensations. I went to the ball game a few nights back with a fellow retired lawyer. I had my monthly weekend breakfast with the professor and the padre. We are, between us, known at restaurants in 2 counties as the bachelor who does not own a waffle iron and the 2 married fellows whose wives wouldn't dream of letting them near one. But naturally, I, like Don Quixote, tend, perhaps quixotically, to retreat to my books when vexed. Rackham on woodlands and legal forests and chases, the wonderful Dr. Susan Westhuizen on anything whatever, Turner and Briggs on panage and swine, Horgan on the Rio Grande, and yet these 2 nowadays are but paper barriers. You will notice that many of these are rereads. Partly this is a matter of taste, and as C.S. Lewis said, the sure mark of an unliterary man is that he considers "I've read it already" to be a conclusive argument against reading a work. But there is more to it than that. Mere preference is not the whole of the story. The problem is, instead, that, to paraphrase Alec Clifton Taylor, so much which is new is so bad. The shelves groan in a conventional and cliched manner, with nonfiction and fiction which is, in its characterizations and in its sense of the world, as devoid of any hinterland as its authors are devoid of an intellectual hinterland. Much of this is the result of the politicization of writing and the consequent belief that the truth is malleable and that good prose is immaterial. As Lewis said, dramatists and novelists are praised as if they were doing, essentially, what used to be expected of theologians and philosophers, and the qualities which belong to their works as inventions and as designs are neglected. They are reverenced as teachers and insufficiently appreciated as artists. This is, nowadays, as true of nonfiction as it is of fiction, and contrariwise. But, as David McCullough has been saying for rather longer than I have been alive, and I am 57 this year, the writing of history, and indeed of all nonfiction, is a literary art. Persons, whether fictional or real, act in accordance with their characters, their natures. Any of them may be a saint at dawn and a criminal by tea time, but the nature of his crime, or the way in which she commits it, is personal, peculiar to that individual. This blank slate notion is a swindle. There is behind every character, real or fictional, as much background and backstory as there is geology in the mountains of Wales or at Honister Pass, where the slate comes from to begin with. Everyone, real or fictional, acts in accordance with his or her nature. Each is a product of his or her circumstances. Biographers, historians, and authors of fiction, of whom there are a seemingly infinite number, unswayed by threat or entreaty, and undeterred from committing fiction, seem nowadays, far too many of them and far too often, to produce flat and two-dimensional characters, mouthing platitudes like so many personified vices and virtues in a medieval miracle and mystery play, all against a stage backdrop which is obviously a stage backdrop, a theatrical flat, a paper moon, a muslin tree, a cardboard sea. They present us with bedraggled, unwise, and unchaste Athenas, sprung grubbily from the unwashed forehead of a hapless and cack-handed Zeus. Give me Widow Twankey in a panto. I saw the other day on social media writing advice, so-called. It was rubbish. It usually is. Cutting through the jargon as best one may, the advice seemed to be to make all conflicts theatrical for all characters, screwed up to the highest pitch of tension and badly overwritten. And it suggested the writing should be as breathless, life and death decisions at every turn, melodrama, the heroine tied to the railway track. The idea seems to be that the reader cannot know what is at stake unless handheld, led to it, and hit over the head with a lead pipe. I think rather more highly of readers than that. I gave a counterexample of prose which does not ratchet up the tension for mere dramatic flair. I suggested a situation quietly written, ominous only in retrospect, in which a man, we'll call him Frank, resented the slights doled out to his wife, whom he loved dearly, by his family, and resolved to take her with him on his next business trip, where his subordinates should perforce be polite to her. As I expected, I was told that this was an insufficiently tense incident with which to begin. I then asked, but what if Frank is actually named Franz Ferdinand? The business trip is to Sarajevo, and the year is 1914. I was dismayed to learn that other commentators did not recognize the situation and appeared never to have heard of the assassination of the dual monarchy's heir presumptive and his wife, or of the Great War itself. So far as that went, I was dismayed but not altogether surprised. I was, however, shocked to be told, firstly, that this failed to account for the feelings, the psychohistory, the agency, and the romantic entanglements of the Duchess of Hohenberg, that all minor characters, including two victims of a murder who are not personally the focus of the book, require to be thus fully explored and explained, so long as they are not members of disfavored classes, men, for example, and that, in any case, the rules are somehow different for fiction. This is nonsense. For one thing, the writing of history, or of biography, or of any non-fiction, is a literary art. Christ, John McPhee makes compelling reading of geology, and could do so of compost. Moreover, not every character is a primary character. Most people in fiction, and everyone in what we laughingly call real life, is presumably the protagonist or antagonist of his or her own story. This does not mean that each is the focus of the story you are writing. They are not any of them Prince Hamlet and are not meant to be. They are often mere attendant lords to swell the scene. As for this notion that fiction and non-fiction have different rules, that also is rubbish. Both are a literary art, and the same toolbox should be used by the craftsman in both. Every fiction writer is the historian of her world, the world in which his characters live and move and have their being. And each such author is the biographer of those characters. Indeed, fiction writers are more than merely the historians of their worlds. They are its prehistorians, its archaeologists, and indeed its demiurge creators, responsible for its geography, geology, geomorphology, and all the rest, even for its weather. History is not a record of the plain act of vast impersonal historic forces. It is mass biography. It records the choices of quite ordinary men and women, and of the great and good, most of whom, in their actions and decisions, were not planning to make history, and did not have an eye on much more than the weekend, the paycheck, the job, the boss, their spouse, dinner, and their mates down the pub. Now, if there are three things against which I consistently preach, these are presentism, partisan history, and the fallacy of the pure and unmixed motive. Presentism, the chronocentric arrogance of pretending that we alone, the living, are moral, is a snare and a delusion. And what future generations shall have to say against our blind spots is a subject for uneasy contemplation. We are not uniquely moral or enlightened, and the notion, taken from Whig history and from misapplied half-assed subliterate popular Darwinism, that history has always been aiming at producing as its crowning glory our own sweet selves, can be accepted only by fools, particularly if these fools are on social media and not wholly blind to the mass stupidity they are on display. History is many things. It is not, pace the tenets of partisan history, a medieval morality or mystery play peopled with two-dimensional personifications of virtues and vices. And for just such reasons, no one not in the clinical and legal sense insane has ever, save perhaps in overmastering rage or obsessive passion, which is why love may be and lust commonly is a madness, c'est venu tout entier à sa proie attachée, acted from one motive only. This being true of the biographies of real people and the history of their real world, it is true a fortiori of fictional characters in a fictional world. Not all characters are main characters. Some are bystanders to the plot, some red herrings, some mere catalysts. Not all characters require to be given full biographies, to be, in jargonistic terms, interrogated. I don't think it right in an author to interrogate her characters. What he ought to do is instead to cross-examine them. But for those characters who are major players in the story, the feigned history of an invented world, the task of the author is the biographer's task. If you must interrogate something, start with your character's bookshelves. Every writer betrays what he reads. Indeed, nowadays it seems she insists upon parading it, and parading its thinness, shallowness, and poverty, and his nescience of any work written before his own birth date. A shocking number of authors today seem to be publishing works, fiction and non, which ring the changes upon, well, as with an overrated and absurdly self-worshipping pop warbler and professional beard, all these productions, like all the songs of the Clarice Starling of pop, might as easily be titled Me. But what do your characters read? Biographers ought always to know this, as ought historians. The reading of a figure, and especially her rereads, faves, and constant companions, matters immensely in figuring the figure 8. If I told you there was a mid-20th century British PM who was a decorated officer, a public school old boy, nostalgic for empire, and a reader of no poetry later than Browning's, you might expect, who? Winston, say? But it was Attlee, which is part of why Clam was at once successful and never quite understood by laymen. Some figures can be limned only in silhouette or sculpted as negative space. They burn the papers, they wear masks. But they don't burn the libraries, and can thus be found out after all. Well, if historians and biographers ought to know these things, you, if you write fiction instead, damned well ought to know what your characters read, loathe, or cherish, and how it shapes them. Then you can tackle the hardest characters to write, non-readers, and far worse, those of one book. Never trust the man of one book, that's an ancient wisdom. But trust all the less one who reads books but once. Jack Lewis put it this way: an unliterary man may be defined as one who reads books once only. There's hope for a man who has never read Malory or Boswell or Tristram Shandy or Shakespeare's sonnets. But what can you do with a man who says he has read them, meaning he has read them once and thinks that this settles the matter? These are persons to avoid in real life. They are a worthwhile challenge to try right. So what's on your character's shelves, and what does that say about them? Or again, to know your characters, you must know their tastes, from their choice in drinks and food to their choice in music. All authors ought to learn the musical tastes of their characters. This includes non-fic authors who can find out so easily, yet tend to give it short shrift without excuse. But the writing of history and biography is a literary art. People say piously that music unites us. Horseshit. Musical tastes and allegiances reveal character and draw lines and define tribes, in-groups and out-groups, us against them, which is useful to authors. If two purely nominal Anglicans, one from the U.S., one from the U.K., aboard ship in the North Atlantic on a Sunday when a service is held, knowing like the same hymns, it suggests the special relationship, literally singing from the same hymnal. In fact, in August 1941, just that helped kickstart the special relationship. FDR and Winston aboard HMS Prince of Wales for the Atlantic Conference on Sunday, the 10th August 1941, singing, "O God, our help in ages past." And you thought I was going with the Titanic reference. Tribal definition. I arrived at university in autumn 1980, assigned a single room in the old quad. As I moved in, I, like all the other Southerners, heard from a large ex-Gilman lacrosse player, for the first time, a pop song by an unfamiliar artist. In 1980, Bruce Springsteen was still a regional artist, pretty much unheard of outside New Jersey, New York, Philly, Delaware, and parts of Maryland. Where you were from dictated whether you'd ever heard of him. The small cadre of Yanks, poor souls, was similarly confused by Carolina beach music. Tribal definition. Everyone in the old quad had brought a stereo and his own records, and we had a laissez-faire, i.e. stoner, R.A. Some Friday nights tended to devolve into musical battles. Someone would start with, "Oh, REO Speedwagon." Someone would reply louder with "Skinnet." Then our Randin water polo jock pre-med twin brothers from Dallas would retort with "Rush." By the time the walls were trembling, there'd be a duel ongoing between, say, Pink Floyd versus Molly Hatchet, Led Zepp versus 38 Special, all turned up to 11. I never started these or played along, but I could always end them. A Bach organ work often sufficed. If that failed, there was orchestral Wagner, or Sousa as the next step, If even that failed, there was Tchaikovsky or Mussorgsky, and if these failed, and I were forced to escalate, some instruments are designed to cut through the din of actual battle. The massed pipes, drums, and bands playing the Black Bear or Loch Duach or Scotland the Brave always brought matters to a close, and quiet descended. Now, think about the tribal definitions at play here, and what it says about all concerned that they had to hand the music they had, take me for one, and what it says about class, time, and place. I cite with permission to G.M.W. Weems' forthcoming Village Tales novel, Ordinary Time, which has spent far too long in editing hell because I, as its editor, spent the last 18 months repeatedly damn near dying. I'll be using these works as examples not because I'm flogging them, or because, good though I find them, I think them the best examples of all time, but rather because I have the rights and permissions to do so, and, as editor, an insight into their conception, growth, revision, and construction. Character and identity. Useful in themselves, more useful when they can be played with or subverted. In Weems' series, there's the Duke of Taunton, basso profundo, wide musical knowledge, sophisticated tastes. However, because his dad was, before succeeding to the title, a rather cash-strapped brigadier doing a lot of liaising with the U.S. Army, the present Duke knows more dirty blues than 99% of Chicago bluesmen. And, like the landlord of the Blue Boar, his local, His Grace is an unexpected fan of the distinctly working-class Northern soul and of music hall, in American English, vaudeville numbers. And then there's Sher Mirza, deputy headmaster at the local independent school. A British Pakistani from Leeds, raised to be genteel and terribly English, an English master, and a musicologist. He teaches only the former. He'd need to teach postdocs at uni to teach the latter and hope to be understood by his pupils. Bit of a music snob. But get him singing R&B at the village concert, and this winner of the Bach Prize, holding the Queen's Medal for Music, this composer and keyboardist, occasions panties being thrown on the stage. Not that it matters, he's chastely in love with the celibate C of E rector. And he's the only observant Muslim in the UK to be purely academically an expert on Anglican service music and hymnody and the English choral tradition. Character and identity, useful in themselves, more useful when they can be played with or subverted. Nor does this happen only in fiction. Let's posit two men, one British, the other from continental Europe. We'll make the Englishman a great fat man, a smoker and a drinker, the sort who, though his mother was foreign-born, is always gassing on to his increasingly weary mates about Poles and the European threat. He's a builder or a plumber. No, we'll make him a bricklayer, a union man who lives in, say, Kent, works mostly out Essex, and does jobs in London, or bodges them, according to a lot of chaps who've suffered the results. His musical tastes are simple, not to say simple-minded. He likes the hymns of his childhood, though he doesn't go often to church, and big brassy military marches, and old music hall numbers. The European, though, he's always been trim. His formative years were in Vienna. He so hates the thought of animal cruelty, he's become a vegetarian. He doesn't smoke and hates drink. He worships opera, Wagner above all. Our Viennese vegetarian has since gone on to a resounding international career. He makes speeches too, but his are listened to worshipfully by most of his fellow Europeans, though there are discordant notes in them to some, yes. Of course, the vulgar British bricklayer suspects the Viennese of dark designs upon British sovereignty in the name of a united Europe, but, well, he would, wouldn't he, that sort of man? If I told you that one of these two was basically a peasant, and the other the grandson of the highest nobility in the land, who'd you pick? The bullish Brit Bricky, or the Viennese? Who's the gentleman, the Wagnerian or the fan of music hall? Who'd you rather have lunch with? I hope, at least, that some of you already spotted the trap, and despair that not all of you may have done, because, of course, the Briton who saved the world is the greatest man of the last millennium, Sir Winston S. Churchill, grandson of a duke. The Wagner worshipper, likewise, is, of course, that demonic shit, that Styrian peasant pissant, Hitler. Now you know that, does it subvert your expectations in retrospect? Sure God it does. And yet there were hints and foreshadowings all along. After all, there's something wrong with the Viennese who worships Wagner and sneers at Strauss and von Suppé, who prefers Rienzi to Richard Potzmann and the Radetzky March. Even the vile Karl Lueger wasn't that mad and bad. And a duke's grandson with demotic tastes in music was just the man to persuade the crowd down the bricklayer's arms to be the lions for whom he gave the roar. Your character's musical taste will always tell you something. If you pay attention and think hard, it'll usually tell you something unexpected and subversive. Life does that. So does good literature. Go thou and do the same. And then there are the things we don't talk about at dinner, but which you must know about your characters, politics and religion. Again, historians and biographers have the edge here. What's incredibly depressing is how few of them seem to care. But a writer of fiction, I say yet again, is a biographer and an historian, the biographer of her characters, the historian of his and their world. Everyone always has had political views, even if these are to eschew earthly politics. I'm thinking here of, by way of example, G.M.W. Weems' saintly Canon Paddock, accused both of conservatism and of radicalism, though insisting his sole constituency is the Civitas Dei, and the only manifesto he follows is the gospel with the creeds. In our real world nowadays, such a man is not a cliché of the Victorian vicar. He's a subversion of the modern C of E clergy. There are real live theologians, I could name one but shan't, who have become so consumed by illiberal, undemocratic, classist, secular politics, I refer of course to Remain, as to have become sanctimonious, hypocritical, abjectly intellectually dishonest, and disloyal to their own sovereign and nation. A theologically orthodox and resolutely apolitical C of E canon is, even in fiction, a refreshing novelty. Everyone always has had, in the socian anth sense, religious views, even if these be atheism or secularism or what have you. Everyone has, in short, a politico-religious personal ideology which informs their character and actions. Good writers have characters whose political and religious views are not their own, and give these the best lines, or at least an equal footing with those who reflect the author's own principles, preferences, or prejudices. I'm well aware that most writers, especially on social media, and especially if fiction writers, share broadly the same views which aren't usually mine. I know, too, that subsets exist with and in their own bubbles. The ideology of most military SF writers, for example, is as predictable as is that of most lit-fic writers, and YA is too often its own special little dumpster fire. I follow writers called writers regardless of their politics, which again generally aren't mine own. If they are wholly beyond all bounds, I don't follow them at all. But I don't follow and then mute for ideology. Partly this is know your enemy. But more to the point, a writer, and especially a fiction writer, must be interested in people and open to knowing, not sharing, but knowing their views so as to create realistic characters. And didacticism and the doctrinaire are, though temptations for the writer, fatal. So get the hell out of your bubble and write all sorts and conditions of men. Educate yourself on what your characters believe and what those beliefs actually are, and how they came to hold them, and how that shapes them. And do the same for yourself, your views and philosophy, while you're at it. You might learn something. You'll at least learn your own characters and make them to live for the reader, which is your job. Yes, job. Writing for publication is a business, just as much as publishing is. And authors enter into a contract with their readers, if any, one which includes express or implied warranties. Fiction authors act necessarily as engineers, pontifices. They are responsible for erecting and maintaining the suspension bridge which suspends the reader's disbelief, and responsible if it doesn't bear the load and collapses. Bridges, I note, require sound foundations and firm ground at either end. And don't send your thurifer and your acolytes to try sense and smoke up my ass here. Neither character-driven fiction, nor fantasy, nor SF is relieved of this obligation. Character-driven fiction requires especially thorough world building, and fiction set far from the fields we know does so in spades. If you set your tale on a sandy desert planet and tell me your main character's musical preferences are orchestral, or indeed anything save a cappella and a bit of rock-on-rock percussion, I'll laugh in your face. Without proper woods, you don't have a string section of woodwinds. Without appropriate metals, the skill to forge them, and fuel to fire the forge, you don't have a brass section. There ain't gonna be no band, as the anvil salesman said. Fiction requires, absolutely demands, an internal consistency and an internal logic. Holmes is an established character, the supreme rationalist. Conan Doyle fell prey to spiritualist idiocy and fairies in the garden. Had Conan Doyle caused the hound to be in fact a demon dog, a shukka, and Holmes to believe in it, he'd have been rightly written off as past it, and the canon would be regarded as closed at the Reichenbach Falls. As for character-driven fiction, so-called, it requires to be driven by character. Character, personality, is fathered by heredity upon environment, and a prior environment in turn is the grandmother as well, for heredity is a product of past environment, including the built environment by which we are trained by surrounding art. Authors who do not world build might as well be so many backwoods fundamentalists, as they appear to have neither any understanding of nor any regard for evolution. As the Texas writer John Graves once said, the land shapes us and goes on shaping the hell out of us who remain on it. People are as they are because of how they have been shaped by their environment and by their hereditary characteristics, which in turn were shaped through natural selection by the environment. The nature versus nurture debate is a stupidity. You cannot segregate the two. Virginians to this day have an atavistic yearning to become country squires. When a Texan makes money, the first thing he does is buy a ranch. People in Britain, and particularly the English, tend, and have tended since the Roman period, to move to the countryside and set up as landed proprietors as soon as they have made their dosh. Why is this the case? Heredity and environment, and it's the environment which proves it. You can trust domestic architecture to tell truths newspapers don't and shan't, and records and propaganda obscure. Yet these urges should not exist or persist unless the world, the land, allowed for their conception and their expression. If you are writing of a world which is far from the fields we know, then you must account for this or for the contrary. So also must you in such cases account for, explain, or otherwise take into consideration and modify similar impulses and similar traits and tropes. Many people seem to have a bee in their bonnet about genealogy and ancestry. The world in which they live provides for this, and the world which does not provide for this shall not see it occur. Herodotus speaks of a Greek who, unlike many Greeks of his period, could trace his ancestry back a full 12 generations before coming to its founding demigod. He prided himself on this. He boasted of it, and did so once in Egypt on the grand tour of that era. The Egyptian to whom he boasted was the hereditary priest of a local temple. That man quietly conducted him, this braggart Greek, into the precincts of the temple and showed him some 40 or more generations of hereditary priests in the paternal line from whom he was descended, without ever coming to a demigod or a demigod's divine father. Litigious societies and landed societies have extreme deference to ancestors and to ancestry, or at least to testamentary records and title deeds. Those with hereditary offices, and particularly hereditary religious offices, also keep excellent records of descent. Ask a Cohen. Societies which tend to ancestor worship, in a sense greater and more literal than you will find in the Tidewater and the Low Country, are equally given to this. Bureaucratic societies are like this. Resilient societies are particularly like this. Until the coming of Islam, Egypt maintained these sorts of records regardless of invasions, plagues, and intervening changes in dynasty. Roman names included filiation. Imperial China kept exact genealogical records. There is at this moment the 83rd generation in direct paternal descent, duly recorded, duly attested, of Master Kung, that philosopher whom we in the West call Confucius. Any FFV can and shall, at the drop of a hat unasked, recite to you the tale of his generations, going back to the first immigrant to what was then the colony of Virginia from Great Britain. For example, Sarah Ludlow, grandniece of Sir Gabriel Pyle through his sister Jane, Sarah marrying the first John Carter, and their son Robert King Carter, being the forebear of Harrisons, Braxtons, Nelsons, Byrds, and, through Anne Hill Carter's marrying Lighthorse Harry, of R.E. Lee. George Washington became interested in his arms and his British ancestors after he ceased, by winning his war, to be British, in part because of correspondence from a distant Washington cousin, the Dowager Countess of Huntington. If some claimant to high lineage is, or believes himself to be, a member of some proud Norman aristocratic family, he could at best recount the tale of his generations to the 10th century, when Rollo and his Norse pirates descended upon Normandy. Some Scots families can do a good deal better than that. A Weems, a Macduff, a Shaw, a McIntosh, a Finlay, indeed most of Clanhatton can do, as can a MacAlpin or a MacGregor, back into the Gaelic mists. Descendants of Norse Gael clans, Guns and MacDonalds, cannot. The most perfect of West Saxon descents is limited in its reach, even if one can show direct descent from Cerdic, and arguably from Elasius or Elafius. But I can attest on numerous lines that a good Welsh pedigree can take one back with legal certainty to the 7th century, and with high probability to the Roman or sub-Roman period. These are common tropes in literature, because readers demand them sometimes, and because some stories require them, and some characters, mirroring common humanity, insist upon them. Everyone wants a royal ancestor. Now demigods are out of fashion. No one wants a shit-shoveling stable lad of whom there'd be no record in any case. But even royals have both. But consider the differences in societies which prize such lineages and their being recorded, and those which don't, or which for want of records cannot. The differences between and among societies which have kept such records, and why and how. The way in which some oft-conquered peoples have managed to save these records, when others which once cherished them then lost them in an upheaval much less devastating than those known to the Welsh or suffered by the Jews, who held on to their records despite it all. What are the explanations for this in your built world? Contemplate the sort of world in which rich merchants and senior civil servants retire with their money to the countryside, to Cotswold Ville Rustique, or to manor houses and a squirearchical life, squirearchy being defined as a system in which the port is passed to the left and office and power to the right. What does a world require to have to make this possible? Remember the question of the character's tastes in reading. Is there reading? Are there books? How and from what are they made? Book comes from beech, and books have leaves as well as beeches do, these having bark which, when stripped, can be made a writing surface. Here's an irony. Dort wo man Bücher verbrennt man auch am Ende Menschen. Where they have burned books, they will end in burning human beings. And the German for a wood or forest of beech trees is Buchenwald. Your characters' clothes, food, housing, literature, music, art, drink, and, frankly, religion, politics, tastes, and philosophy, all rooted in the natural world you must build for her, and build rationally, believably, and well. The craft requires this of you, and you owe it to the reader, who, even if not paying you directly, by, for example, borrowing your book from a library, is undertaking the opportunity cost, the squandered time he might have spent doing something worthwhile, such as going to the ball game and listening to TMS, of reading your book, or trying to. You have an obligation to make your characters three-dimensional, and to add, by corroborative tale, an air of verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. Yes, I do have a little list, and punishments to fit the crime. To do that, you must place them in three-dimensional space, a world. To turn again to the example on which I have the right to draw, Brother Weems' village tales, like those set in Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha County, or Trollope's Barsetshire, Harper Lee's Macomb County, or Peter Maugham's Batch Magna, like Miss Reed's Fairacre, Thrush Green, and Caxley, have a very definite setting. In this instance, a bit of southwest Wiltshire which appears on no map. Except, of course, it does appear on maps, a fictional Ordnance Survey map of the Wolfunts, and a schematic of the district as a whole. There's no Jefferson without Monticello, no Winston without Blenheim and Chartwell both. There's no Miss Marple without St. Mary Mead either, no Holmes without 221B Baker Street, no Mr. Badger without the Wild Wood, or the Toad sans Toad Hall, no Arthur without Camelot. In nonfiction and fiction alike, this matters. M.R. James wrote the best ghost stories ever written, and maintained that the key was to persuade the reader that if he's not very careful, this sort of thing might happen to him. Susan Hill and George Knight, like Du Maurier, do the same. How? By creating a sense of place, and a sense of deep time, and of deeps behind time, and of places deeply rooted. Monty Rhodes James is unsurpassed precisely because his are the ghost stories of an antiquary. His most horrible bogies may be unnaturally, menacingly thin, but it's the deep solidity of his world and its feigned history which makes thin ghosts terrifying. It is not only the physicist who must understand that space and time are conjoined twins. Bram Stoker pulled it off in what was frankly a mere potboiler, due considerably to all the freighted associations Whitby and its church have. Its infamous crepuscular counterpart of today is merely a shabby, anemic, curiously bloodless pastiche, a streetcar named Vampire, with a shirtless werewolf screaming in cod Brando accents, "Bella! Bella!" I am not an archaeologist. My degrees are in politics, philosophy, but not economics as well. No PPE for me, thank God, and law. And so far as relevant personal history goes, I did my brief and wholly undistinguished hitch in the 60mm mortar section of a light infantry company. Not very long since, a month or so ago, the distinguished Dr. Susan Westhuizen discussed on social media a couple of Cambridgeshire villages which had changed over the years the focus of settlement in the village, but which had not moved their parish churches, now rendered distant from the villages. I noticed that both churches were riparian, streamside. Now, I looked before I left. Doomsday Book and later records told me that both churches were, and remained through the relevant period, the responsibility of the Abbot of Ely in the one case and the Archbishop of Canterbury in the other. Not men inclined ex officio to moving and rebuilding at their own cost churches at the convenience of villagers who owed suit to other secular lords, as I recall it. And yet, these were riparian churches, after all. Because I am the man my experiences have made me, my own tendency, when looking at a landscape, is to ask, how was it taken, how defended, and afterward, in peacetime, how held, and by whom, and by what title, and how devised to the heirs? Military and politico-legal questions, of course, devoid of any tendency to see landscapes in sacral or ritual terms, and questions having the merit that any digging required to answer them is in nice, clean documents, not in earth, something I shouldn't have done at gunpoint when I was able-bodied, and damned well shan't do nowadays. But, because I am the man my experiences have made me, and a complete mongoose with it and an elephant's child, still playing spot the source here, and points mean prizes, I know enough to know that ritual and sacral landscapes exist, or that sacral and ritual influences persist on the land, and that running water has been a natural altar since, the Mesolithic at least, remained so into the Norman period, and persists worldwide today, which is why there are coins in fountains from Canberra to Rome to D.C. and wishing wells. I am not an archaeologist. I am that reviled and despised thing, a narrative historian. And I was aware that a natural response to any interjection from me might easily have been, though not from Dr. Westhuizen, "Oh Christ, it's some bumptious American horning in." All the same, I had the courage of, if not my convictions, though even former lawyers occasionally have convictions, at least my curiosity, and asked, had anyone done any work on whether churches by water were more or less likely to be moved and rebuilt in response to changing settlement patterns? I even had the temerity, the cheek, to invoke the august name of Francis Pryor. There's a point to this anecdote. No, really, there is. It's W.G. Hoskins' point. Everything is older than we suppose. This is true in our world, even in Australia and North America, much more so in the UK and Europe, where you can hardly take a way through the wood, even when there is no way through the wood, without stumbling on antiquities. It must, if your fictional world is to be worth a damn, be equally true of invented worlds. Thomas Mann spoke of time coulisses. Seamus Heaney speaks of the weight and heft of words. The Anglo-Saxon, that is, the Saxonized British poets, were fascinated by old stone works, the work of giants in the landscape. It is only modern authors of fiction and non-fiction alike who, like domestic geese, wake stunned every morning to a fire new world. If your work, your words, are to have solidity, if the suspension bridge of disbelief is to bear a load, you must attend to the weight and heft of worlds, and that world must have a past, partly obscure, forgotten, almost illegible, as ours has. Jerv's Wolfontein district and the Downlands and the Vale have that. Abbott's Glebe, Claudius's Camp, which typically for such names on a map is in fact pre-Roman. The Wolf Down Chalk Horse, long obscured and forgotten, as old as Uffington's. Roman roads and St. Aldhelm's Preaching Cross. The River Wolfburn and the Wolfonts and the Wolburns and Wolchester and Wolminster and Staple Woolton, having to do neither with wolf nor wool, but sharing rather the same prehistoric root, unknown and unknowable, as the Devon River Wolf, 2 counties to the westward. The similarly underivable ancient names of the Wolfburn's tributaries, the Rushlight, which has nothing to do with rushlights or lightly rushing waters, and the Westland Brook, as mysterious as the river Nada into which the Wolfbund flows. Pincotmore and Coitmore Wood, the abraded forms of the great wood, Coidmar, so ancient as to be unlinited. Authentically woolly names, Shifford and Lambsford and Hawksburn, the fords of sheep and lamb, and the bourne of Hoggets. Fullenmollena and Wadleycombe and Tenterdown, cloth mill and source of woad for dyes, and the place of tentinate the fabric, and the yarncombs in the vale, and things higher and deeper and older, old sacred places taken over with Saxon names, but older than Stonehenge and Amesbury, Freeford, Wreathbury Rings, Wade's Barrow, Wadpool, Wadhay, Grimmel'smere, and the two Grimsbarrows, Frigga's Ford, the Cursus of Chetha, the barrow, pool, and hedge of Wade the ferryman, father of Wayland Smith, the mere of a, if not the, Grendel, and Woden's, Grimm's Barrows. And amidst these is Woodwoe Wood, once part of the Great Wood, the Wood of Woodwoes, the European Sasquatch figure. Now, you'll many of you be complaining already that this sort of thing is too much work and too taxing and asks too much scholarship and isn't important anyway. I resist by main force the temptation to retort that it's your job as an author and matters hugely, as we've seen, and is what you owe the reader if you hope to have and keep any. I confine myself to noting that none of it is wasted. Everything new you learn of your world opens new possibilities for your writing. It operates even for seat-of-the-pants writers as a running outline. It generates plot points. For example, one of Joe's main ensemble characters, the Duke of Taunton, that peppery, martial little man who'd be even funnier to me were I not one of the models for his more exasperating foibles, is married to, well, obviously to his Duchess, yes, but a Duchess who, in her own right, is Professor the Baroness Lacy, Fellow of St. Chad's, Durham, and a renowned archaeologist and historian. Archaeology is bulking increasingly large in the series. And if you are writing a series, or anything which may become one, you'll be glad you kept your notes, even unto the NVC plant communities at various locations, if you're whimsy, when you come to publish the companion volume to the series. Meanwhile, you, at Phantom's Wiki and on your own authorial website, and educated fans at, for example, TV Tropes, have something interesting to post for readers and potential readers, as is true of Jervis Village Tales, as linked below. There's also this. Even an historian finds from time to time these sudden excitements of putting something together which had been unexpected. I can say as an editor that the writer of fiction gets, quite evidently, a great deal of fun out of this voyage of serendipitous discovery which is world-building. The sudden insight, the happy shock of discovering that an element cast up by her subconscious fits neatly into something new and something plotted alike, or that a name picked at random becomes unexpectedly apt or unexpectedly weighted with consequence, consonance, or connotation. The sheer joy of the explorer in virgin territory. If this strikes you as too much work and not at all enjoyable, give up now. Go back to your day job. You'll never make a writer. After all, writing, like publishing, is a business and ought to be conducted accordingly with the work put in. And none of that work need be wasted, and good craftsmanlike work is required of you by the craft and by the market, the reader to whom you've an obligation. History and biography is the literary art of putting facts in context, deep context. The same is true of the history and biographies of your invented world and imagined characters. The king died and then the queen died is a chronicle, a statement of facts. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a narrative, far beyond the fashion and fad for interrogating minor characters about their feels, like Deputy Brangus tracking down them damn chicken rustlers. A box score or a line score tells you who won the game. Patient attention to them will tell you how, and who drove in the winning run, and which pitcher took the L. But what gets memorialized in Cooperstown is the swing of the Staten Island Scot, Bobby Thompson, on a walk-off homer, the despair of Ralph Branca, the shot heard round the world, Russ Hodges' call. There's a long drive, and it's going to be, I believe, the Giants win the pennant. 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 Bobby Thompson hits into the lower deck of the left field stand. The Giants win the pennant, and they're going crazy. They're going crazy. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I do not believe it. Bobby Thompson hit a line drive into the lower deck of the left field stands, and this blame place is going crazy. The Giants. Horace Stoneham has got a winner. The Giants won it by a score of 5-4, and they're picking Bobby Thompson up and carrying him off the field. It's as iconic as Kenneth Wolstenholme's They Think It's All Over when England beat West Germany in the World Cup. Dare to be iconic. Aim for Cooperstown. Win the pennant. Hoist the cup. Put in the damned work as you're obliged to do. Stop moaning and get cracking. Titles, prizes, hardware, pennants, series rings, the ashes earned are earned with the sweat of your brow. And I am but one of many who's trying to give you the tools. Hey, Mac, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Here endeth the lesson. Go forth and write. Next time, we talk about cultural literacy and what in hell happened to it.